Thank you, Chair. We're now live.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Local Development Plan Advisory Committee. We've got quite a full agenda this evening with a number of guest speakers who are doing presentations, and that will be followed by, a discussion when we'll have the opportunity to raise points and question the speakers. There's a number of people here this evening. There are the councillors who are members of the committee. We have a number of council officers, mostly from the planning policy team. And we also have some members of the public who've indicated that they would like to speak to the meeting, so they'll have a chance to speak later on. I think we'll introduce these people, as we proceed through the meeting, and we also have, of course, members of the public who are watching via the YouTube link. As I say, we've got quite a busy agenda, so we'll make a start, I think. First of all, apologies for absence and substitutions. Do we have any apologies or substitutions?
There are none, Chair. Thank you. There
are none. Okay. Urgent matters. Okay. Well, no one has notified me of any urgent matters. I don't know if anyone suddenly wants to notify an urgent matter. If they do, please speak up now. If not, I'll move on. Declarations of interest. Does any of the councillors who are members of the committee wish to make any sort of declaration of interest? Okay, I can't see anyone there. Okay, so matters to be considered in private. There aren't any of those as far as I'm aware. Okay, so on to the main business of the evening, which is the local development plan update and our speakers. So first of all, I'll ask Renato, who is a member of the planning policy team, to briefly introduce tonight's topic, which is design, and say a bit about the speakers, and perhaps also, Renato, you could say a bit about the supporting documentation, the character study, and the housing design guide, because I have had some people ask, that they would like to see the draft documentation before the meeting. So perhaps you could just put us into the picture as to the status of those documents, and give us an idea of when there'll be something that can be circulated for comments. So if that's okay, Renato, I'll hand over to you, and then we can move on for the introduction, and then we can start with the presentations.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. Just by way of background, at the last meeting, the committee received an update on the work programme for the new local development plan. The committee also agreed a cycle of future meetings, each with a different theme. So tonight we're focused on design and also conservation, actually. So over recent times, we've all heard terms such as good growth, good design, building beautiful, but what do they actually mean? The government has published a raft of guidance to help us decipher this, and the new London plan also provides some further policy direction. So to help us navigate through the maze towards achieving good design and to look at ways that we can deliver this in practice, we have a range of speakers this evening. So firstly, we have Mark Lately Murphy and Lionel Eade, associates from Allies and Morrison, urban practitioners. They've been commissioned by Ealing Council to undertake work on the Ealing Character and Housing Design Guide. So we'll get a flavour of some of the work that's been done on that. The presentations will include quite a few snippets of what's to come in terms of the published documents at some point in time after the meeting. That's going to be followed by Joanne Preston, who's a principal urban designer from the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service. And she'll look specifically at design codes. We've heard a lot about these recently, particularly through the planning white paper proposals. And she'll cover some examples from across the country about how they can be applied. We'll then move on to Adrian Harvey from Frame Projects, and he'll provide a brief update on Ealing's design review panel and community review panel, which were both set up recently within Ealing. And he'll run through what their roles are, what their remits are, the membership of each, and some of the schemes that they've been looking at in general. And last but not least, I'll cover the conservation area review. I'll talk about some of the work that we've done, some of the key proposals around boundary changes and other proposals. I'll talk about some of the recent consultation that we've done with the conservation area panels, and also look forward to next steps and the next round of public consultation. So I think, Chair, what you're going to allow is some brief questions in terms of clarification after each presentation, and then allow a wider discussion towards the end, if that's correct.
That's the idea. Yes. Yes. Any points of clarification after each presentation, but more general questions we'll consider at the end. And the presenters will be around as a panel to respond to them and participate in the discussion.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to Mark, if you want to share your screen and start off with the character assessment.
Absolutely. I'll just get it up shortly. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see that. Just say good evening to everyone. Really grateful to have been welcomed here to give you an update. And Lionel and I will talk you through the Ealing character study and also the housing design guidance that we've been preparing in collaboration with Renato and his colleagues. So kind of a good starting point just to consider for those who aren't familiar with some of the terminology and why the studies come about is the role of the London Plan and how this has been recently published, the new London Plan in March of this year. And there's a whole suite of policies in there concerned around character design and intensification. So really sort of in the lay terms, a question that we're trying to answer is how can we make best use of available land in a way that responds to some of Ealing's most distinctive characteristics? Hence, a characterization study and housing design guide has been commissioned, which is sort of endorsed by the London Plan itself. This has been funded through the GLA Home Building Capacity Fund. Is a combined character study and housing design study to try and cross-fertilize one another and improve efficiencies. As I said, this has been commissioned in accordance with the London Plan design policies, and it's the strategic scale study that looks to identify those specific characteristics, but also opportunities for growth and where these could be targeted. It's a really timely piece of work, and a lot of local authorities are commissioning these as they look ahead to their local plan reviews to form a cross-cutting evidence base that can then sort of seed other strategies and pieces of work. So there are three pieces of work, three studies that we've prepared. An A1 report, which looks at borough-wide mapping, GIS analysis, and characteristics of both physical and socioeconomic characteristics. The A2 report is focused more on sort of building types and their characteristics, how these can be used and best deployed for intensification in different parts of the borough. And then also a housing design guide, which looks at drawing through sort of best practice in housing design, residential design, and specific sort of chronic issues that might be associated with typical typologies and building types found in the borough. We've produced this over a series of months from spring 2020 until sort of just up to now. having gone through a global pandemic, we were very happy to have got our site visits, sort of really quite extensive site visits underway and completed before the pandemic really took hold. And it's sort of been a really great sort of learning experience, pulling these together, and hopefully we can run through them and share some of this with you this evening. It's worth flagging part A1 was presented where we'd got to in the previous LD pack meeting in July 2020. So predominantly the focus would be on part A2 and then also part B. So the A2 report, typologies and scope for growth. First of all, we'll sort of pause to consider some of the borough typologies and where these are found. So we have undertaken what we term sort of a taxonomic classification of different building types and where they're found across the borough. These are organised by their sort of common characteristics and qualities. And we find it really helpful to sort of split these out, and really helpful then if you're comparing sort of these different trees, typology trees across different parts of London, you can really see sort of the DNA and the makeup and how this varies from place to place. And indeed, this is evident through different parts of Ealing Borough itself. We sort of undertake this mapping exercise, which has been really helpful in terms of understanding patterns of distribution and different trends. And often these relate to periods of historic evolution, and also sort of key geographical features such as the Brent Valley and how that sort of sweeps through the borough, and how that then sort of gives rise to different typologies and their relationships to open space. We then sort of unpack each of those colours and typologies to provide sort of a concise overview of a profile of each, generally where they're found, some of their key characteristics, and then opportunities for enhancement or their role in intensification going forward. So we sort of got a couple of examples where we take a look at some of the different town centres in Ealing, provide the sort of overview of where they're found, and sort of key sort of graphics that are trying to spatially and visually represent sort of the level of grain. Is it a fine grain and quite historic? Is that rubbing up against things which are quite sort of coarse grain and quite recent, and sort of larger floor plans? And we sort of take a look at those and how they vary, their key characteristics, and also then try to complement that with case studies of where, in this instance, town centre redevelopment and intensification has been done really well, and in a character-led way when you're thinking around the scale and massing and the rhythm of roof forms. And we sort of draw on these from across parts of Ealing where they've been done well, and then also across parts of London and the rest of the country when there's a relevant context. Similarly for industry, there's a whole range of industry of sort of big floor plates, big sort of shed style warehouse buildings in the borough, but then also a much finer grain of historic fabric, which found in parts of around the Vale and Acton. And we consider some of the adaptability of those places. Can they consider sort of alternative futures in a different type of workspace and continue being productive? And other opportunities to enhance those sort of conditions, bearing in mind some of the London plan policies around if you're introducing other mixed uses, that you need to sort of intensify and co-locate those in the best way possible. Similarly, an example of townhouses, found some really sort of rich Georgian examples in parts of in Acton, some of the span housing in the 1960s in Montpellier, and then also recent interpretations found around Acton Gardens and how these have been really well deployed in sort of graduating in scale between a lower density neighbourhood and then the higher density urban blocks of the principal blocks of Acton Gardens itself. Another example being some of the few mansion blocks that can be found in Ealing, but actually a really great role that they have in terms of townscape and also density, and examples of some mansion blocks found in Kilburn, where these have been used as part of estate regeneration to provide front doors and windows onto streets while still being high density. I'll hand over to Lionel, and we'll be doing a bit of back and forth.
Thanks very much, Mark. So in this section of the A2 report, we then start looking at how those individual building typologies that Mark described combine to form development blocks that you typically find across Ealing. So overall, the report assesses 8 development block types to understand their potential for improvement and intensification. Those block types relate to local centres, arterial routes and corridors, business or industrial campuses, urban and suburban perimeter blocks, developments inspired by Garden City principles, freeform modernist estates, and other estates laid out according to cul-de-sacs. I won't unpack each of those in detail, but instead I'll give you an overview of 2 examples that will probably be fairly familiar to you, and that will also give you a sense of the content and its breadth. So in the first example, you have the suburban perimeter block, beginning with an overview of its typical characteristics on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, a visual illustration of a range of opportunities that one might find on these types of blocks, ranging from the retrofit of existing buildings to improve their condition and environmental performance, the alteration and extension of terraced and semi-detached homes, the infill development of gap sites and backland garages, and new build developments on corner sites, and finally, the more targeted comprehensive redevelopment of properties that are in poor condition. So I think it's worth saying at this point that this isn't a guide to how to comprehensively transform a block. It's just giving you a range of examples of different forms of intervention, some of which may be appropriate in certain locations and not in others. The next example looks at local centres, and here it's a slightly different story because it's less about residential intensification and improvement and more about a mix of uses. So we look at how the public realm can be enhanced, how upward vertical extensions of existing offices and buildings can be resolved. We also look at pocket parks and infill opportunities in car parks, and how to introduce higher density housing and mixed use buildings within town centres, as well as infill opportunities as well.
Thanks, Lionel. So we've sort of going from the bottom up to a higher spatial scale in a way. So starting at that building scale and what's characteristic, then taking that in the rounds, as Lionel explained, thinking at the block scale and where are opportunities for enhancement and accommodating growth. And then actually we sort of move up to borough areas, which we find a really sort of helpful exercise. We try to sort of undertake a high-level neighbourhood analysis, which in itself is an inexact science. It's actually quite counter to planning that often operates in quite hard boundaries and red lines, what's inside and outside. But for the sort of realms of character studies, these are sort of a really helpful intuitive geography that are quite simple and a helpful sort of organizing thoughts. You can sort of see on the left how we've grouped and coalesced some of these neighborhoods into larger borough areas, and then also undertaken a really high level density analysis of them. And you can really sort of pick out that trend of that higher density, quite compact, intensively used inner London character in the east of the borough. And then actually as you sort of that gradual gradation out to sort of the west of the borough that has a much lower density, more sort of spacious and open character. And that's sort of helpful as we sort of move on to look at an example of a borough area. The London plan itself, it sort of tasks local authorities with undertaking analysis of opportunities in areas that might be suitable and appropriate for growth. And in a way of doing that, we sort of take a character-led approach to understand how could character be used and enhanced in some areas. But it's also helpful to sort of take a socioeconomic, almost top-down lens approach to consider things that underpin livability and how pleasant places are to live in terms of access to open space, relative affordability, close proximity to shops and services and public transport. So we've sort of undertaken a bit of GIS analysis in this study, but also then taking a look at how regeneration can play a role in tailoring that to address really quite cross-cutting strategic issues, such as things around deprivation. This is really helping build up a high-level brief for different parts of the borough, and should proposals and development proposals and regeneration schemes come forward, how you can really sort of look at these broader spatial objectives and strategic objectives and think, how can I plug into that? How can I contribute to that? So in the instance of Acton, we sort of have a series of 3 spreads that aims to be quite concise. It looks at sort of the key profile of these areas, and you sort of got a figure ground plan that is showing what is built in black and then what's open space in white. And it's really interesting to see those sort of patterns as they vary from some of the coarse industry in the north around sort of Park Royal, and then the finer grain urban terraces and quite compact towards also then some of the garden suburb typologies as well. So it's really quite varied in this part of the borough, owing to its sort of rich layers of historic evolution. We sort of also and complement that with some of the spatial analysis, socioeconomics and demographics, thinking around people per hectare, so population density, that access to open space and where areas that are deficient in access to open space. Also elements around ethnicity and diversity, and overcrowding. So it's really quite a holistic overview of the conditions and characteristics of each of these parts of the borough. We sort of augment that with drawing on some of the typology analysis earlier in the study to understand what is that pattern of distribution found here, what are the most common typologies, and how are they spread out. We include sort of a variety of photos to help illustrate some of these really core and varied characteristics. And then also some commentary on this sort of potato plan of the different neighborhoods. And again, it's all about sort of creating this overarching sort of catalogue that people can draw on to help sort of tailor bespoke responses to the different qualities that comprise Acton borough area in this example. And then these sections conclude with a set of sort of strategic objectives, character-based growth themes, as we've termed them, and thinking about, okay, what are sort of common areas to address, what are these common issues and opportunities that we find sort of recurring in this part of the borough. So we think around reinforcing the grain of urban blocks and making sure that sort of small, finer grain opportunities continue to sort of prevail. That's very characteristic of this part of the borough. And it also gives a thought to where there are sort of larger opportunities, as we said, around some of the Acton Gardens regeneration is a great example and precedent to think about, well, here's estate regeneration. There's a great opportunity to accommodate quite a dense sort of mid-rise scheme, but actually is that those transitions in edges and how, as I talked around, some of those townhouses can be used to transition into the sort of lower scale, finer grain parts of the neighborhoods. Sort of another example I sort of touch on is thinking around Northolt, and it's really very different character, much sort of more spacious, lower density character. And as we sort of have gone through this and come through what's prevalent, what's there, and what are priorities and objectives, it's much more around sort of a strategic approach that's needed to sort of unlocking this for densification and new homes and a quality place that is nice to live around. And that's sort of thinking around sort of the fulcrum of the White Hart roundabout, bringing improved public transport services and amenities to this part of the borough. I'll hand over to Lionel to introduce the housing design guidance.
Thanks again, Mark. So in section B, the Ealing Housing Design Guide, this section sets out principles for developing high quality new homes in the borough. It's particularly focused on small sites, so those under 1/4 hectare as it's defined in the London Plan. And it's been developed as a natural extension to the character study with frequent links back to the A1 and A2 reports for reference. In terms of the content, the Housing Design Guide covers 4 main areas. There is general guidance first, that all applications and future developments need to respect. Then there's thematic guidance for conditions that recur across the borough. There's typological guidance for particular residential building types. And finally, it also provides design guidance for taller buildings. It's also worth mentioning that the guidance in this document would be applicable to applications for prior approval, as it does for general planning applications as well. And in order, if you just go to the next slide, in order to make the guide as helpful and practically applicable for officers and applicants, we introduce it with an overview of where it fits into the national and local policy context, and we provide a sort of short flowchart of steps to take when using the report. So next slide. We've also aligned the guidance as much as possible with the National Design Guide and its 10 characteristics of a well-designed place, so that applicants and officers will see familiar headings such as context and identity, which are unpacked into a set of key principles that explain how and why proposals need to take certain urban and architectural design measures into account. So under responding to character, we explain how applicants can use baseline analyses to understand an area, its natural features, movement networks, building types, distinctive heritage, and how to respond positively to those characteristics. Then under coherent and legible places, which is the next slide, we explain how existing buildings can be modified, and we provide visual diagrams and illustrations of the spatial parameters for rear, side, and loft extensions, as well as more qualitative guidance. Then under landscape considerations, we explain how natural interventions in the form of green infrastructure, how those can improve biodiversity and the amenity value of public spaces. We also accompany those with some photographic examples of good precedents within and near the borough. And then under functional and sociable spaces, we provide guidance on appropriate uses for different locations and how health and well-being can be improved through the design of homes and buildings. And that includes principles around inclusive and accessible design. And then last but certainly not least, we unpack the kind of critical climate considerations. So aspects of climate mitigation and adaptation, looking at how to limit energy demand through design, how to provide a kind of cleaner and greener energy supply for large-scale developments, how to build less and repurpose buildings and their components, and finally explaining behavioral changes that need to happen, like increased monitoring of energy usage and the introduction of smart technologies in buildings. So we do make reference to useful documents like the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide in the section and building regs, relevant sections of the building regs.
Thanks, Einol. So as Lon touched on when he introduced the document, we also take a look at thematic guidance for a core set of conditions that repeat across the borough. We look at sort of town centres and neighbourhood centres, waterways, and also movement corridors. These sort of set out sort of high-level commentary on where these are found across the borough, drawing on from some of the characterisation work and drawing on some of those issues and opportunities. There's sort of key guidance, which is common across them, thinking about sort of reinforcing that street hierarchy, making sure buildings and plots respond to that. And then also thinking around some of the suitable typologies that could be appropriate in these settings. It's a useful exercise also to then sort of be drawing on some of the helpful precedents and really be kind of stating quite concisely and clearly what they've done well and how they've been successful, drawing and sort of encouraging applicants to do similar in some of their studies and some of their proposals. In sort of corridors and intensification, there's a sort of similar approach. And again, thinking around sort of the scale and massing as these address these principal movement corridors, but also trying to build in cross-cutting guidance around some of the sort of daylight, sunlight, noise and air quality considerations for some of these quite busy conditions. There's certainly the role that the built environment can play in these contexts in terms of enhancing overall character and trying to shift the character from being quite a sort of movement oriented place to actually feeling more like a place for people in the street. But it's also about balancing those considerations with, again, what it's like to live in those settings and conditions. And then typology guidance, we sort of drawn on some of the most characteristic typologies found in the borough, and provide a set of guidance that looks at some of the chronic issues that are related with sort of adaptation of existing homes and properties and how they can be done best, and then also opportunities for intensification and how they might be able to accommodate new homes and buildings in a sensitive and characterful manner. We take a look at some of the garden city and cottage estate characteristics. There's great examples of this around sort of Wrentham Garden suburb, and really strong examples of sorts of arts and crafts buildings. But then actually this sort of form of development and its relationship to set pieces and layouts, you can find in other parts of the borough where they've been done less well in sort of a more of a post-war iteration. And there's certainly opportunity to enhance those by drawing on the characteristics found in more successful examples, such as the Brentham Garden suburb. We sort of set out some of the key characteristics and qualitative measures to take into account under built form, scale and massing, context and identity, and also the types of intensification that would be suitable. Provide sort of good and bad examples about adaptation, but also reinterpretation and where these typologies have been deployed in new settings and have been successful. And then also set out a series of sort of annotated plans and diagrams to consider and to sort of augment some of that qualitative considerations in more sort of detailed urban design and also architectural design. Similarly, suburban terraces and semi-detached, which proliferate across parts of the borough, again, a big role here for guidance on adaptation and sensitive side extensions and rear extensions and how this can coordinate and not undermine the actual integral built form of the original proposal. And then cases, sorts of those chronic issues relating to sort of car ownership and degradation of boundary walls and privet hedges, and also opportunities for higher density typologies and where they would be suitable in specific conditions where generally the overall quality of that sort of property or building is quite low and has been lost. Lionel.
Thanks, Mark. So in what I think is the final section, we look at more specific design guidance for tall buildings. So in terms of considering the context, we try to unpack and explain to applicants how they can start to think more broadly about their site. So how they take in a kind of more comprehensive understanding of the built environment when they're proposing tall buildings. So we do ask them to present a series of options of how they got to a tall building proposal, including more sort of mid-rise and high density examples. We encourage them to think hard about how to redistribute height on larger sites in particular, rather than having single points of very tall buildings, how to distribute heights more evenly, how to retain the sort of cross-sectional profile of existing streets, and how to introduce things like zones of theoretical visibility testing, accurate visual representations, and verified views analyses of their proposals to make sure that they really do work with the townscape rather than against it. We also encourage them to think about the natural environment and how to work with the site topography rather than against it, and to try and limit excavation where possible. And then the next bit, what makes a London tall building? This was quite an interesting way of applying some of the lessons that we learned in the A1 and A2 reports about thinking about the local character and what makes something, a tall building, distinctively of London and of Ealing. And we sort of whittled it down to a few characteristics, including buildings that evolve traditional historic building types that you find in Ealing and in London, buildings that offer visual intricacy, buildings that are internally diverse, buildings that are tailored to their site, buildings that are multi-layered, both aesthetically but also functionally, buildings that tread lightly on the ground, and so on and so forth. If you move on to the next slide, then we get to that point about how buildings meet the ground, so encouraging permeability where possible, trying to work with the existing movement networks and routes rather than closing them off, encouraging a finer grain of building rather than larger floor plates, and providing welcoming, attractive, well-lit, secure entrances at ground floor. So that's kind of broken down into the three sort of strata of tall buildings: the base, the middle, and the top. Looking at the composition of the facade, and also how to hide mechanical equipment and things like lift overruns and satellite dishes in the crown in the top section. And then finally, a bit on microclimate, so how to avoid issues of extreme wind turbulence and the urban heat island effects by introducing setbacks to tall buildings, stepping the massing, or providing canopies that can mitigate wake and downwash and those effects of excessive wind. And the last bit is thinking more kind of broadly about sustainability, not just environmental sustainability, but the social sustainability, the role that tall buildings can play when they're internally diverse, when they offer higher densities and a richer mix of employment uses to neighborhoods close to stations and public transport connections. There's one more bit. Yeah.
So what we had been doing is drawing through some of the character study, the typologies work from the A1 and A2 report. And then as we were embarking on the design guide, we were working closely with some of development management colleagues at Ealing, and trying to make sure this felt like a usable guide and that it had appropriate information that could be deployed in different settings, so that it sort of hit the ground running and was sort of user oriented. And through some of those conversations and through some of the testing that we were undergoing with sort of different applications and different forms of development, it was deemed it would be helpful to prepare sort of a design guide checklist, which we include at the conclusion of the report. This isn't necessarily a tick box exercise where you decide if it's sort of approved or declined. It's a more qualitative review, and it's actually sort of more of a tool, a discursive tool to use in collaboration with applicants, where you may have an application coming in at sort of early stage pre-app, where you're going to be focusing around sort of on that concept design or some sort of high level principles. And then it can be sort of a helpful steer to think about, okay, well, in the next iteration, it would be helpful that if we could then talk through these elements. So it's not a hard and fast way of determining applications. But again, it's this sort of tool to make sure that applicants feel well prepared when they're coming forward to discuss applications with Ealing officers, but then also it can be sort of used as this qualitative element. And we found it was quite successful in some of the testing that we were doing with officers. Finally, there was a set of precedents, and we've sort of got a couple in the back of the report, which is drawing on and trying to tailor sort of appropriate typologies and why they've been successful to some of the different settings, thinking around some of the waterside, canal side settings in Ealing, then also some industrial intensification. We're trying to sort of densify employment and also introduce residential in those settings. And then again, sort of those transitions in scale and how introducing and really deploying really characterful Ealing-based typologies in sort of a modern interpretation and characterful setting. So lastly, just to say thank you very much. Hopefully that's been really helpful. And I think we've left enough time for a couple of questions if the chair wanted to undertake that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, guys. There was a lot of content in there, and I mean the other presentations, I'm assured, sort of will be shorter than that, but obviously this was quite a big one. Before we move on, is there anyone who has any sort of quick questions of clarification to either Mark or Lionel? So please use the hands up function or the raise hands function in Zoom.
Sorry, Paul, for some reason it's not working on mine tonight. Don't know
Okay,
why.
as I was going to say. So yeah, okay, okay, Linda. So Councillor Burke, please go ahead with your question.
A couple of questions. One is that being on planning committee, do we use such a tool as this? So I've not in my training had this, and appreciate that it may be new, so that might be why, but that's really one of the big things. And secondly, big fan of qualitative things, big fan of discursive things, but in my experience of attending planning committee, the trouble with qualitative and discursive is that they all get pushed to one side. I've not seen character really being discussed at all in planning committees. And when I've specifically asked the question, both in committee and out of committee, about how do we weight character, it really hasn't been answered in any way that I could quantify or measure or usefully use. So the question is, how do you do that with this kind of tool?
Chair, perhaps I could come in on that to start with.
Okay, Renato, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of how we're going to use the guidance, the aim is to treat the study in two parts, really. So part one is the part A is the character study, and the typology guidance, which we'll use as evidence base for the local plan. And the third part, the design guidance, we're going to adopt that as local planning policy guidance. So it'll be guidance that officers and members can refer to as having quite a lot of weight, because it's in compliance with national and regional policy. So we'll use it as that sort of local planning policy guidance, and I'm sure we can do some more sort of training along with members and officers about how it's going to be used once it's actually published.
I'm not sure that exactly answers my question. It's very helpful, but my question really is about the weighting of it against other considerations, and with something that is basically as comprehensive as this, how do we make sure it is used, and what are the consequences if it's not? That's what I'm not really getting to grips with at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, it is guidance, and as you say, design is an issue that can't always be necessarily narrowed down, but it is guidance, and as where it complies with national policy, with the London Plan policy, then it has that extra weight. But as you know, Councillor, each case, each development has to be treated on its own merits. But these derive from national sort of good practice policy guidance, national principles about design. So, you know, in theory, they should have quite a bit of weight. But as I say, we'll offer more guidance on this, and maybe give some case study examples as well to help you with that.
And Paul, am I allowed to say this at this point? But can we make that as firm action from this then, that as this starts to unroll, rather than waiting until 2024, that those councillors that are on planning committee are fully appraised of it? Because otherwise we could get right down to 2024 and none of us are using it in the way it's intended.
Okay, what is that you're suggesting, Linda? Linda, that there is training for the or updates for members of the planning committee on
and that they're expected to attend it, that, you know, it's not a kind of nice to do thing, that we're actually expected to listen and take notice. Okay,
I think we can have that as a recommendation if other members of the committee agree that you know, that planning training includes this topic, that the use of character studies and design guidance.
Yeah, we can certainly take that back and roll it out as part of the elected member training module in future. Okay,
that's great.
It's worth saying just briefly, because I know you need to move on, but there's sort of being quite a sea change in previous years around design and character, and in sort of 2019, the National Design Guide being published. That's the first time that's ever happened in this country, in terms of trying to raise and embed high quality design in the planning system. And then also subsequent to that, it's been rolling out a National Model Design Code, which is looking to try and create some greater certainty and embed sort of character and identity again in planning decisions and determination. So this is sort of a stepping stone in that journey, really, to try and bring that more into sort of the way that applications are sort of deemed and how applicants actually draw on character. So it's a point in time, and we're going in the right direction.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, I can see a couple of hands now. I can see Councillor Shaw's hand, and I can see Kay, who is a sort of guest member of the public. So first of all, Councillor Shaw, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just very briefly on the sort of design characters and so on. You alluded in the presentation a couple of times to identifying character and design within Ealing and between the town centres, whether that's sort of Acton, Ealing, Greenford, Northolt, wherever. So my question in the round is just what or how that might differ to other other areas or design characteristics around London. You know, bearing in mind we've got the London plan sitting overarching in terms of sort of planning guidance and planning regulations. You know, London as a whole has sort of evolved over the years, and you know what I'm suggesting is that what's found in Ealing in areas is very likely to be found in most of the London boroughs as well. You know, most of it will be due down to when the houses were built. You know, whether they're Georgian, whether they were in the interwar building years. You know, and that sort of aspect. So I was just wondering if you could just sort of explain a little on that, of if there was anything that's very distinctive about Ealing, or whether it is sort of more in the round of London's development as a whole.
I mean, it's excellent question, and it's something that crops up in time again. I think there's so much sort of the emphasis on obviously on the character and what we're trying to raise the standard of sort of design, but also in essence, what we're trying to really capture through these studies is like sort of people and place. So sort of in the example of Southall, some of the socioeconomics revealing sort of the really sort of ethnic diversity there, and trying to think about actually, so how can new development and regeneration propositions in those settings cater to the needs of the people that inhabit them. So in terms of character, it's sort of the lifestyle character. In some of these places, it's very much around sort of multi-generational living, which is fantastic, but also that sort of in areas started to degrade how some of the design integrity of some of these urban terraces where they've been sort of expanded and really become more compact. So actually sort of trying in that sense to set the brief for thinking, are there new typologies, sort of larger typologies that can come forward to facilitate and meet the needs of people who live there, and ensure that people can continue to live there and not actually find that they need to sort of move out to sort of outer parts of London. So there's the issue around sort of built character and trying to raise the quality, but also what's different in Southall compared to what's different in Ealing is sort of about the uses and the lifestyles that's facilitating, if that helps.
Okay, is that okay, Councillor Shaw?
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Mark. Yes, it's about sort of trying to embed the people in the centres, if you like, rather than just the built environment purely itself.
Okay, thanks. Kay, do you have your question?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, well, I have a couple of questions. One is, when are the reports going to be available for the public to read? I saw the first presentation when it was first given last year, and I think everybody is very anxious to be able to have a look, in particular at the area where they live. So that's question one. Question two regards tall buildings. Tall buildings, I would argue, pretty controversial in this borough, because it is essentially a low-rise 2, 3, up to 6-storey borough, or was until recently. I just question the definition. I was looking vainly on your page to see any kind of clear definition of what you mean by tall buildings. In the London plan, a tall building is defined as 6 stories minimum. And we have a tall building of 55 stories in the planning pipeline. So that's a huge range for definition. And I think people would like some kind of security about what we mean by a tall building, given that they're not very well liked. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So those are good questions. I guess that's more questions for Renato than anyone else.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah,
answering those, Renato.
I'll have a go at those. Thank you, Chair. In terms of publication, as Kay's mentioned, the A1 report was published last year. It's been slightly updated, but that's more or less been done now. And similarly with the A2 reports, we just need to do some topping and tailing. So both of those should be available in the next couple of weeks. In terms of the design guide element, we're still working to bring that alongside other parts of the local planning policy guidance that I talked about earlier. So we're looking to publish that sometime next month in November. So yeah, it shouldn't be too long now, hopefully. In terms of the tall buildings element, yeah, we do realise that we do need to do some more work around tall buildings in terms of, the local definition of what a tall building is in relation to Ealing. we're fortunate in a lot of the work that Mark and Lionel have done for us gives us some background information now, but we still need to do some further work in terms of analysis to understand how, what is a tall building in relation to Ealing's specific character and context. So yeah, we need to do some more work on that, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Renato. Anyone else want to quickly comment on those points? I don't know if Mark or Lionel want to say anything, or if not, then we'll move on. Okay, let's move on to the next presentation then, which is on design codes, which is by
sorry, Paul, I had my hand up.
Sorry, Simon. Yeah,
I was just saying, I think we understand that there's a legal action about previous tall building that we're waiting for the decision, the legal decision about. And I think, as I understand it, when that happens, then there'll be a statement on tall buildings. That's my understanding. Wasn't it your understanding?
It's my understanding too, and that statement may be fairly soon, but I don't know.
So I don't think they can say anything about tall buildings until there's the result of this legal decision that's about to come.
Well, that is a factor. I mean, do you just want to elaborate on that, Renato? I think Simon's pretty much said most of it, really.
Yeah, I mean, there is an appeal ongoing, I think, in Manor Road in West Ealing that has to be decided. But I can't really say much more than that, I'm afraid. I don't know.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Okay. Well, sorry, I missed your hand there, Councillor Woodruff. I can't see any more hands. So unless anyone shouts out now, we'll move on to the next presentation. Is that Joanne? Is it Joanne or Joan? Joanne, are you ready to do your bit?
Yeah, it's Joanne Preston. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, so yeah, my name's Joanne Preston. I'm the Principal Urban Design Officer at Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service, and I'm going to talk about design codes today. And I'm very much talking about them from the perspective of how we use them in Cambridge. We've got quite a bit of experience with design codes for large-scale strategic housing and mixed-use development, such as Northstowe, which is 10,000 homes, on a former RAF base. Is going to be developed over 3 phases, and so each phase has its own set of design codes attached to an outline condition. So the way that we use design codes is we work quite a lot with outline planning applications, and the design code is then a condition of that. And so the design code is there to bridge the gap between the outline and the reserved matters application. And we've found that to be really successful. But I just want to kind of caveat this, because there's quite a lot of talk about design codes at the moment, kind of being the answer to everything. And I think there are a couple of other factors at play. So I think, for example, we are quite lucky in Cambridge that we have really good architects working on the developments that we're involved in. We have quite well-established processes for monitoring design quality, and we also have a really well-resourced built and natural environment team. So there are about 20 officers in sort of urban design, landscape, ecology, sustainability, working at sort of pre-application and design review and things as well. So obviously the use of design codes is at the heart of changes to national planning policy. It's very much an evolving context. And so, like everyone in Cambridge, we're very much trying to get to grips with what the new legislation means for us. But I think there are 2 main things that kind of come out of these changes, and the publication of the National Model Design Code and the National Planning Policy Framework changes put a greater emphasis on design codes applied at an area-wide scale and produced by local authorities. And I think it also puts a greater emphasis on community engagement in developing design codes. And I think that's something in Cambridge that we would want to look at in more detail. So design codes, they're essentially a set of illustrated rules that for the sort of physical development of a site or area. They build upon an existing design vision, such as a master plan or the design development framework. In other words, they're part of the process. And they tend to use a kind of comply or justify approach. So they use a kind of series of diagrams and short written text using language such as must for mandatory code and should for discretionary codes. And they can be produced by different people at different stages of the planning process and for different types of site. So, for example, they might be produced by a local planning authority or developer or landowner as part of a supplementary planning document. They might be produced as a developer as part of a planning application, or they might be produced by the community as part of a neighbourhood plan. But they tend to be produced for the same reasons, or similar reasons, sorry. And that's that they improve coordination on larger sites built out over different phases or by different design teams. They respect existing, they ensure that new development respects the existing character of an area by setting rules based on existing typologies that reinforce positive characteristics. They can help to empower local communities. They're a really good way of breaking down quite complicated technical information into really understandable diagrams and written information. So they can be very much used as a learning tool. And they can help to build consensus, sort of getting buy-in from all the different stakeholders throughout the design process to provide a greater certainty for everyone involved, so everyone knows what they're going to expect from this development and the type of level of design quality to expect. And I've just kind of got a couple of examples because I think people get a bit confused about the difference between design codes and design guidance. And I think actually it is a spectrum. And I think often design codes and guidance work well together, actually, often in the same documents. But just to kind of, I guess, touch on some of the kind of complexities of this, I've selected a few examples of different design codes and guides. And what sort of tends to differ is the level of prescription in each of them. So, for example, the Tiverton Neighbourhood Plan Design Code was for a whole area produced for a neighbourhood planning group, and that was prepared by ACOM. And that kind of tries to cover quite a lot, but not very much detail. So actually, I would argue it's possibly more of a guide than a code. It doesn't have specific sites. And then you've got something like the London Borough Tower Hamlets Central Area for Good Growth, which is much more typology based. So it's selecting the sorts of infill sites that are often coming up for development, and it's setting kind of general rules around those. But it's not dealing with specific sites, it's dealing with types of sites. So you can only kind of be so specific with that guidance, obviously, without having an actual site to talk about. And then there's kind of what we're used to in Cambridge, which is the sort of urban extension sites and the strategic sites. And that's where you can actually, you build your codes from a master plan and a set of parameter plans, and you can actually be much more detailed. And that's what I'm probably going to talk about in a bit more detail. But just to kind of show you what these different types of codes might look like. I mean, this is called a code. Again, I would say this is more of a guide, but you can see it starts to kind of set out ratios of built form to street width. It starts to set out street typologies and the types of kind of vernacular features that new development might sort of respond to. This is the high density infill sites. So it's a kind of toolkit. Again, it's quite specific about what it talks about. It's not going to start talking about things like, you know, street hierarchies and things, because the streets are already there. This is about infill. So it's about kind of the footprint, the layout, the built form, and the design and appearance. And it's kind of setting out relationships to existing typologies without being super specific, because this might be applied to slightly different sites across the borough. But it's kind of giving principles and rules of thumb, really. And again, I'd say this is somewhere between a code and a guide, really. And then this is kind of what we use in Cambridge. So this is where I think design codes are really useful, because they're just kind of form part of the natural process of detailed design. So this is where you have an extension site. The design code builds on a master plan. It covers quite a lot, and it covers some elements in more detail than others. So it has a set of kind of site-wide codes, which are more principle-based. And then it also has some quite specific details, such as setting out exact street sections for different street typologies. So yeah, just to kind of emphasize really that the way that we kind of understand this, I think in Cambridge, is that actually there's kind of design codes and design guidance work together, and actually, you know, current national policy is very much talking about the design code as this document, but actually we find that we have design codes within our master plans, actually within our outline planning, in our outline planning applications and our parameter plans. There are elements of coding in there, and equally there are elements of design guidance within the code as well. So it's blurring really, but the level of specificity tends to increase as you get towards the more kind of plot specific detail. And really, for a code to work, it has to be underpinned by this kind of feedback through pre-app advice, design review, and community engagement. And you need all of that working together, really. And it's also just understanding your local policy context really well. So, for example, in the codes that we produce, the codes that developers produce in Cambridge as part of outline planning applications, they tend to not include things like cycle parking, and there are certain elements of sustainability design and construction which we include in SPDs because they are associated with all of our strategic sites. So there's no need to kind of repeat that within the design code. And so it's just being aware about what actually needs to be included and really narrowing it down so that the code itself is a really usable document, and it's not just kind of too cumbersome to actually use a pre-app and design review when you're making your decisions. And yeah, just kind of underpinned by pre-app and design review. And so we treat the production of a design code in the same way that we would any other application. So it's developer-led. They go through a series of pre-apps and design reviews, and we try to use the same officers and the same panels so that those officers who are assessing the code really get to understand it. That helps achieve buy-in, so that then when you actually come to use the code when an application has been prepared for at the detailed stages, everybody's kind of really aware of what that code is trying to achieve and what that does. And this is something that I think we need to kind of, or we're hoping to shift our focus on in Cambridge. And so at the moment, the engagement has very much been up to the developer. And I think the design code part has very much been seen as a technical document. And I think this is where the national policy changes things slightly, and there's much greater emphasis on community engagement through producing the code. So this is actually from a slightly different project. This is from a village design guide that we've done within the council. And this is working really closely with a small group of residents in different villages, and then kind of creating a zine of what it is that they kind of really, what's important to them about their village and where they would like to see improvements, and then using that to feed into SPDs. So that's not something we've applied to code yet, but I think this is where we're heading. And then I just wanted to very quickly go through a really good example of a code, and just to kind of touch on that in a bit more detail and what makes it great. So this is the Wing urban extension. So it's an urban extension to the east of Cambridge by Hills. And this code was done by Pollard Thomas Edwards architects. And I think what's excellent about this is it doesn't try to code everything. It's very specific about the kind of where the detail is applied. So you can see here, this is the sort of overview of the master plan, and in the areas that are faded out, that's where kind of site-wide kind of good design principles are applied. But the areas of kind of important public realm that you see here in a darker colour and highlighted because they're important areas of frontage, that's where there are much more specific design codes applied, because they're the kind of parts of the scheme that kind of give it its character and really make it an interesting place. And this built on a set of parameter plans that were produced as part of the outline application. So this is quite typical for us to have a movement and access, land use, built form and landscape parameter plan. And you can see the kind of level, there are almost bits of codes in this in text. And then you go on to much more detailed guidance and code. So this is kind of almost building on that movement and access parameter plan by setting out exact street typologies and sections, general principles that can be applied to the entirety of the site, so built form and its relationship to streets, materials, so good examples, and then what should be avoided. And then the character areas that I picked out before in much more detail. And then this is actually from a slightly different code, but I think it's a good example. In Northstowe, we also use design codes, and one thing that really worked well there is that at the end of each section on each plot, there's this summary page, which is just sets out the whole code in 2 pages for that area. And it means that you can, well, I mean, it doesn't have all the detail, but it's enough that, you know, you take that to your pre-application meeting and it's there in front of you. You don't have to leaf through a 200-page document. And then a design, excuse me, and then a design code compliance checklist as well. So, you know, the codes are there, but I think it's kind of what was touched on earlier. It's a part of a qualitative discussion. So actually, we're always open to improvements being suggested on the codes, and we just need to keep track of that and make sure that we know why these changes have been made and make sure that it makes sense. But we're not there to kind of stifle innovation. And then this is just a kind of a plug really that I've also done some work around applying design codes for modular methods of construction on large scale developments, because I found that the codes that we were using at the moment didn't really account for new construction methods. So that's available online if anybody's interested. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Joanne. Are there any questions to Joanne about design codes or what how they're being used in Cambridge? I can't see any hands so far. Okay, so speak up if you, okay. Right, I can see Councillor Shaw now. Okay, yes. Go ahead, Councillor Shaw.
Thanks for that, Joanne. That was very interesting. I mean, it's seeing the practical side of how the design work can actually be used and applied to help achieve, you know, things in conjunction with residents' views as well. So that I think is really helpful and interesting. I was just wondering, sort of, for how long has this been in development? Obviously, we know sort of 2019 the National Design Code were being brought in. So did you start this in 2019? Have you been going for a couple of years, or has it been going for longer than that? You mentioned sort of having 20 officers all working on this, which, you know, is terrific. You know, of course, it'll raise the question soon for Steve, I'm sure, of just how many officers Ealing might have that are looking at this, you know, in terms of getting the structures right to apply something similar. So, you know, could you just let us know how developed it is and how long it's been going, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think, so actually design codes have been in national planning policy, I think since 2006, and it's only really since 2019 that I guess they've just kind of come to the forefront in a way, but they were actually, they've actually been around for quite a while. And I think Cambridge were actually involved in a pilot project testing design codes on large-scale strategic sites in 2007. So I think that's why we're quite advanced with this, because that's the sort of sites that we have in Cambridge that's seen an enormous amount of growth. So yeah, so the slight change in direction, I think, is that it's now been design codes are being applied to larger areas as opposed to just strategic development sites, and they're being it's being kind of pushed that local authorities might produce them. Obviously, that raises all kinds of questions around capacity and local authority. And to be honest, even in Cambridge, I don't know if we have the capacity with all our officers to actually produce design codes. They're still developer-led. So we've got a bit of a head start, but I think even for us, we're still trying to understand what this means. I don't know if that answers your question, hopefully.
Yeah, no, it is. That's really helpful. Thanks, Joanne.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Joanne. Okay, I can't see any more questions, so obviously we'll have a chance for more questions after all the presentations, but let's move on to the next presentation then, which is Adrian, who's going to tell us about the design review panel and the community review panel. So over to you, Adrian, if you're ready.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Councillor Collin. Let me just share my screen. Let me do this. If you can tell me if that is visible.
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so what I want to do is just give a very brief update on two tools that the borough has to hand to improve the design quality of development in Ealing. The design review panel and community review panel, which have both been set up this year, and which Frame Projects helps to manage on behalf of the borough. First couple of what I'm going to go through is the role of design review and community review in the planning process, and then talked very specifically about the design review panel and the community review panel to set out who's on them, how they got there, what they're doing, what they've been looking at so far. We've heard quite a lot about the recent changes in the policy framework that's gone on, and that certainly affects design review. But design review itself has been around for almost 100 years. It's ramped up recently, but there was the Royal Fine Arts Commission for the best part of the 20th century, which was providing design advice on nationally significant development. That became much more locally focused during the early years of this century. Now the National Planning Policy Framework makes reference to design review panels that local authorities should have regard to recommendations made by design review panels. And the London Plan also says that boroughs and applicants, both of them, should make use of design review process to assess and inform design options early in the planning process. So that's the policy basis of design review. There isn't much in the way of policy basis for community review, but that's because it's a very new development. We know of 6 community review panels in the country, and Ealing's is the first borough-wide one. So you've actually broken some ground by establishing a borough-wide community review panel. I think Joanne did mention that the revised NPPF does talk about the need to involve community voices, and we feel very strongly that community review is a great way of bringing those voices in. What do these panels do? Well, they provide expert independent advice to applicants and to borough. What's different between them is the kinds of expertise they bring. Design review panels bring technical professional expertise, and the community review panel brings expertise that derives from living in a place, knowing what it's like to live there and having a sense of the place and how that will impact on their local community. So that's what they're for. I'll say a little bit about how they operate as we move on, but I want to start off with the design review panel, which was established in March this year. So it's been running for about 6 months. It's got a membership of 23 who are drawn from architects and urban designers and landscape architects, but also experts in heritage, sustainability, inclusive design and transport. Those panel members were recruited through open recruitment and went through a selection process to make sure that Ealing had access to the best quality design advice possible. We have 2/3 of the panel have sat on other panels before. 1/3 were new to design review panels, and we think that's a really good balance, because what it means is you've got enough people on there who know what they're doing, but you've also got some fresh perspectives coming to the table. We're also very keen to make sure that the people on the panel had a close connection to the borough, and so we were able to achieve 1/4 of the panel being people who live or work in Ealing. Half the panel are female, and 1/4 are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So it's a reasonably good representation and has a huge amount of expertise available to the borough. That starts with the chair, Catherine Firth, who I believe is on this call, but has dialed in on the phone. She's currently in the States for business, so wasn't able to get onto the call as the rest of us have. But she is around, and she, I don't know if Catherine, well, she can say hello later on. We have a vice chair in Andrew Baharrell, who stands in when Catherine is unavailable or is conflicted, because all of the panel members are active in the industry, and sometimes they will be working on projects or related to projects that they're reviewing, and obviously they can't serve in that case. So that's why we have a vice chair. The panel members are listed here. In the course of the 6 months since the panel's been up and running, everyone on that panel has been to at least one review. We have a little check today. Some people have been on more often than others, but I'll explain why that is in a minute. But everyone has. So we've been able to draw on that wide selection of expertise and experience. Design review operates, well, the design review Ealing operates on the basis of 3 different models of review. the first and the main one is a formal review, which is the chair and 4 members of the panel who have been selected because their expertise, their areas of interest, their experience is suited to the scheme under discussion. We also operate chairs reviews. I think there's only 1 or 2 of those so far, which is the chair and 1 panel member, which is for smaller schemes or returning schemes or schemes where planning officers feel there is a particular area that needs to be talked about. So rather than the whole scheme, just the sustainability angle, for example. And then the panel member who's selected will have that expertise. And then another model that we haven't actually used yet in the 6 months is the surgery review, which is a more iterative, collaborative advisory role, if you like, where rather than the panel casting a judgment on the proposal that's presented to them, works with officers and with the applicant to try and improve things in an iterative way. We think that that will be particularly useful to Ealing as you develop policy, because what we can do is bring external independent expertise to look at policies and other documents as they're being pulled together as an advisor rather than as an adjudicator. So as I said, we've been running for 6 months. There have been 15 review meetings, which is obviously more than more than 2 a month. It's been a busy panel. I mean, I look after a couple of other local authorities panels, and this one has so far been much busier than those other ones. So it's been busy, which is great. You'll notice that we've had 15 reviews, but only seen 11 schemes. That's because we've had 3 schemes come back more than once. 1 scheme has come back 3 times. And that's important because it means that as a big scheme develops, continuing consistent advice on its development and evolution can be given. And as things unfold, it's been very useful. So we like to see things early and preferably, as you'll see on the next slide, preferably before an application, but we want to be able to go through the iterative stages of that pre-application process. So this is what we've seen in terms of type. 13 of those reviews have been private developer, 1 has been local authority led scheme, the other has been a joint venture. The vast majority, 13, have been pre-application, and they have mainly been residential, but 13 of them have been mixed use, so residential with commercial primarily, with which particularly around some parts of the borough is a very common kind of developments coming forward. So that's the kind of thing we've been seeing at the design review panel. Community review panel is at a much earlier stage. It was set up in August this year and had its first meeting in September. The second meeting was this week. It was on Tuesday evening this week. We operate 2 teams, I suppose, is the best way of putting it. So there are 24 members, but 12 of them will be at each review. And that's because we wanted to be able to offer 2 slots a month for the community review panel to look at schemes. They meet in the evening. It's not reasonable to have more than 1 scheme on any given date. So the design review panel will see more than 1 scheme in a day. It's not reasonable to do that for people who are giving up their evenings on a voluntary basis. But again, we had an open application process, which was widely disseminated around the borough, and we had an active selection process where we actually put candidates through mock reviews to see how they operated, and that was part of the selection. That was the main part of the selection basis. But also we wanted to make sure that the panel represented all parts of the borough and also represented the demography of the borough. So we have a quarter of the panel living in Ealing, a quarter living in Southall, and the rest distributed around the rest of the borough. The only place we had trouble recruiting it was Permeability, and we tried very hard to find more. That 4% represents 1 person. We tried very hard to find more applicants from Permeability, but weren't able to in the time scale we had. But we will be refreshing this panel as we go on over the years, and we'll obviously look to address that deficit. Composition of this panel is 67% female, 46% BME, and 21% disabled or people with disabilities, which is really good. And what we've already seen at the community reviews that have happened so far, the people with disabilities on the panel have been very, very, very good at highlighting problems or issues or potential for improvement within the proposals that have come forward from that perspective in terms of inclusive design. The age range, we haven't asked them all their ages, but we did ask them to tell us what age bracket they fitted in. The youngest isn't 18, but is in their very early 20s, and the oldest is above 75. So we think we've got a good spread of the residents of Ealing, not represented because this isn't a representative group, but it reflects the nature of the community within Ealing. The chair of the community review panel is Daisy Froud, who is one of the country's leading exponents of community engagement in relation to the built environment, and we're very lucky to have her, and she's been great so far. And then underneath there is listed the people of the borough who are serving on the community review panel. Next one. As I said, we've only had 2 schemes so far because we've only been running for about, well, I've only been active for about 8 weeks. We don't have chairs review, we don't have surgery review, we only have full review, which is where 12 members of the panel meet to consider a proposal. As I said, we've had 2 schemes at 2 different review meetings. They've both been pre-application, they've both been privately developed mixed-use schemes, and it's early days, but it's been going well, and we're in the process of writing up the report, which will go to the applicant of the second one at the moment. And I had a quick look at the draft of it before coming on this call, and it's not remarkable because we know that this is what you get with the community review panel, but the quality of the comment and observations that have been made by the panel are at least as coherent and constructive as those that we get from the design review panel. It's a really powerful tool, and the 2 panels we envisage working in tandem. You know, the idea is that the schemes that go to the design review panel will also go to the community review panel, so you get that fully rounded impression of what or how schemes can be improved and lead to great design for Ealing. And that's me. Those are web links to more information about the 2 panels. I know this presentation will be up on the website afterwards, so that you don't need to note them down now. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take any.
Okay, thanks very much, Adrian. Are there any questions specific to the design or community review panels that anyone wants to ask?
Yeah, can I just quickly come on to that?
Yes, Councillor Mahmood, who is a councillor from Perry Vale, so I know why no one is applying from there. So go ahead, Councillor Mahmood.
I'm sorry, I don't know whether should I take as a compliment or should I take as a point of improvement, but we'll talk about that later on with Andrew. So just wanted to know about the right participation of community review panel, how they work. If they are talking about one scheme, so how they will internal structure will work in terms of either they agree to go ahead with this, so they do the voting, or how they would, or the only discussion, or if they are not happy, what they would be happy to do the recommendation. Just could you let me know about that, please?
Sure. There isn't voting. It's a discussion, and it's a set of views, and the role of the chair on both kinds of panel, actually, because believe me, there's disagreement on the professional design review panel as well. The role of the chair is to pull out the common messages that the panel wants to give. So the panel is briefed at the beginning with the issues that the local authority, the planning officers would like to particularly to be focusing on. The chair takes the panel through those themes, comments are made, the reactions to those issues, and we then produce a report. That's largely what we at Frame do. We synthesize all those comments into a report which represents the common collective view of the panel. But it's their observations, their comments. There are recommendations, but it's not the role isn't to give a big tick or a big cross. It's to identify things which aren't working and things that are working, and most importantly, to identify things where things could work better.
Chair, can I just go? So would that be community review panel would be not overriding the community engagement process?
No, it's supplementary. All of these processes are supplementary. The views of the community review panel and the design review panel are material considerations, but they're weighed with everything else.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Mahmood. I can see Councillor Burke's hand as well, and also Councillor Woodruff. So, Councillor Burke, go ahead.
Thank you. I think that was really helpful and a really welcome development. Just a couple of things in terms of how they get used. So obviously that whole thing about, are you a representative or are you there because of your actual skills and abilities? Even more difficult in a situation like this where feelings are often strong. So how would you advise councillors to advise other residents how they might interact with these people, or should they be interacting with them at all? And then a follow-up question from them is, should councillors be interacting with them? Same issues of challenge and it being perceived as lobbying. And last question on that is also, how then do we really get the local flavour of the issues if you've got one person from a particular big area or what have you?
Right, those are all really, really good and important questions, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you definitive answers to them. One of the with the community review panel, one of the prerequisites for being considered was that you didn't already have either a professional route to enforcing design quality or a community. So people involved in campaigning groups around built environment weren't excluded, but it was we were more looking to find people who aren't already engaged. If that makes sense. Yeah. People who aren't tied into those networks. And that's mainly because we think that those voices need to be heard or deserve to be heard, but also so they were not captured by influence and being lobbied, if that makes sense. So if someone is there from a campaigning group, are they representing themselves and their neighbours, or are they representing the views of that organisation? So whether the wider community and indeed elected members should be engaging with them, I'm not sure. I think probably the not would be my guess, but it's inevitably going to happen. I mean, yeah, these people live in the community; they're going to interact with the community. I would personally, I think that where you can avoid directly pursuing in a way that might be construed as lobbying, that would be. I mean, to be honest with you, though, there's not an awful lot of point in lobbying them because their views are advisory. I mean, I think, yeah, it's really, really hard to answer. I'm sorry, I haven't given you a very good answer on that. What was the second question? I've lost.
I think it's how you really get the flavour of the local issue. And sorry, I am going to add one other quick one. Is what if their views are ignored then by the planning committee? Yeah.
So this panel does not pretend to be formally representative. I mean, you are formally representative. That's your role. This is a reflection of the demography of the borough, and we wanted to make sure that the whole breadth of Ealing borough was represented or was reflected, not so that the person from Perry Vale is the voice of Perry Vale, but just so that you get that the different kind of understanding that comes from living in different parts of the borough. The experience of living in North Acton is very different from the experience of living in Perry Vale, is very different from living in Southall. So it's not that those voices should represent those places, but just that you've got that breadth of experience and expertise which comes from living there. I've forgotten your supplementary question. Sorry.
How about the planning committee taking any?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's obviously up to the committee, and I think a lot of that will depend on the quality of the advice that's given, because it's supposed to be helpful advice rather than a don't do this or do this. So I think it needs to be balanced carefully against other factors. It can't be the only factor. So I think that as long as it's taken, consideration is seriously given, then that's the best that we can do. So one of the things I know from how panels relate to applicants, to developers, sometimes the panel will give advice that the applicant rejects. And if the applicant can show that they've considered it and investigated it and decided against it, then that's, for me, that's fine. If you know, it's advice, it can be rejected, but what it shouldn't be is ignored. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. Okay, Councillor, if that's okay, Councillor Burke, we'll move on to Councillor Woodruff.
Yeah. So I think there are 2 points. One is, and you might have mentioned, I might have missed it, exactly how all these people have been appointed. Are you appointing them, or how did that go? Who actually appointed them? But and secondly, I think you've got 2 panels. So the first one, you had, I think it's about a quarter were from Ealing, which I didn't think was it. Then the second panel also had a quarter from Ealing, but then you did a bigger breakdown and realized that quarter was from, there's a difference between Ealing and the London Borough of Ealing.
Yeah. Yes.
And the second one, I thought, oh, there's only a quarter from Ealing, then there is the other 3/4 were from other parts of the London Borough.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, at the first one, it just said there were 26% from Ealing. Is that on a similar basis, or
no? So the 26% from Ealing is of the borough. So a quarter of the professional panel live or work in Ealing Borough.
So 3/4 don't. Is that
no, and that's we tried very hard. It's the number of architects who want to sit on a panel who live in Ealing. It's a function of that. I mean, we could have probably, although not necessarily, could possibly have sourced an entire panel from residents of the borough, but whether they would have been the best people to give that independent expertise is that's why why it's a minority of the panel are resident. At the same time, when we were setting it up on behalf of the borough, we knew that there would be a community review panel which would be 100% represented, or 100% resident in the borough. So it's not that,
And it was you and your organisation were appointing them all, was it? From
we ran the recruitment, and we produced a shortlist, which then went through a selection meeting with officers at Ealing. Ealing officers made the final decision.
All right. Okay.
We put out the advert. We sifted through the applications. We ran the numbers on representation, and then we presented a shortlist to officers who made the final decision.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Fine.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much, Adrian.
Okay.
So unless there are any more questions, I can't see any more hands up. Let's move on then. Oh, hold on. There's one from Kay. Okay, quickly, Kay, can you sort of ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask whether there is anything that is out of bounds when you come to consider design, because obviously one of the key issues for individual sites is the quantum of development that's going to go onto that site. And I mention this only because prior to the formal design review panel. We have had a design review panel for a particular site in the centre of Ealing, but my understanding is that the quantum of development it certainly wasn't presented in the report, and yet to residents it's quite an important issue.
Sure. I wonder, I might try and bring Catherine Berth, the chair of the design review panel, into this if she is still on the line. I'm not sure, but I'll start by saying nothing is out of bounds, and believe me, quantum and density are things which are regularly raised by design review panel as much as by community review panel.
Thank you.
Okay, Catherine, are you there? I can see that someone is dialed into the call, so
maybe not.
Maybe she's not. Maybe it's not her, or maybe she's not listening.
Yeah, it is her, but maybe as I said, she's in the States at the moment, so I'm not sure what's going on exactly. But
okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Kate. Okay, well, we better move on quickly then, as time is marching on, I'm afraid. Okay, so finally, it's Renato to give us a fairly brief, I hope, update on where we are with conservation areas. Over to you, Renato. Yes.
Sorry, Chair. I'm just going to share my screen. Just bear with me. Can you see that?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm just going to rattle through this, given that there isn't much time now. But I just wanted to give a brief update on the conservation area review that we've been undertaking. Just a brief update of where we are, some of the key proposals and recommendations, give you a flavour of some of the recent consultation that we've carried out with the conservation area panels in Ealing, and also give you a flavour of the next steps in terms of forthcoming public and stakeholder consultation. So this slide really just gives you an idea of the coverage of conservation areas in Ealing. So we have 29 areas across the borough. And actually one of those is now within the OPDC area. That's the Old Oak Lane area. But the rest of the conservation areas are fairly well clustered around Ealing, around Acton, and around Hamwell, and less so towards the west and north of the borough. And I think that really just reflects almost the sort of historical development of the borough and some of the more in the sort of surviving fabric that exists in the other areas. These slides just again give you a flavour of the range and diversity of conservation areas in Ealing. They range from almost sort of semi-rural areas such as Northolt and Churchfields conservation areas. It includes common land such as Ealing Common and Haven Green. It includes parkland such as Walpole Park. Even includes Victorian cemeteries in Hamwell, and includes a lot of the transport network as well in terms of the canal network and also the rail network as well. We're also fortunate in Ealing to have some of the first garden suburbs at Bedford Park and also Brentham Garden Village. There's quite a range of architecture within those conservation areas, again ranging from Georgian architecture, Victorian, Queen Anne Revival styles, Edwardian, interwar housing of all types, including some modern 1960s developments, and some of our town centres, particularly Ealing and Acton, include some fine Victorian Edwardian architecture, and including some shop fronts as well, that some of which actually survive in good form. So, as part of the review, we asked 3 fundamental questions for each conservation area. It's been some time since we last did a review. It's been certainly sort of 10, 12 years in many areas. So we've been asking, what are the key changes that have happened in those areas in the last decade or so? Are there any revisions that we need to make to the conservation area boundaries? And that's both in terms of reduction, where there's been some degradation, and also additions, where new information has come forward about the quality of the heritage asset. And thirdly, are any additional planning controls or guidance needed? And controls in terms of Article 4 directions, which can restrict permitted development rights in those areas, and also where additional design guidance might be needed. So we carried out an initial review between 2018 and 20. Those initial findings were reported to LDPAC last summer, and there's a link on the page there that people can still see those reports. And very briefly, in terms of the key findings and recommendations from that initial review, we found that the existing character appraisals, which accompany each of the 29 areas, generally remain sound but do need updating in some areas. Each conservation area has a separate management plan, which are useful to an extent, but they are quite repetitive and lack specific detail and direction. One of the key recommendations is to roll all of those into a single generic plan for all conservation areas, which actually makes it easier to work with as well for officers and developers. Existing boundaries remain on the whole justified, but some boundaries we found that do need to be changed. Last year, we were proposing that some areas would increase, some would decrease in terms of coverage, and that there would be a net decrease of about 8%. Now, these figures will change if the most recent proposals are taken forward, and I'll come on to those in a second. And we recommended that we should probably look at increasing the scope of Article 4 directions in some areas to tackle issues that have been affecting those. We also recommended additional guidance would be useful to help respect the unique character of each area. We thought that there should be a coordinated approach towards looking at enhancement opportunities within some of our conservation areas, particularly around some of the town centres. Look at investment and access to grant aid from Historic England and other sources, so that we can actually improve the fabric of these areas where possible. And we also found what I call the sort of oversight of some of the conservation areas is a challenge in terms of some of the resource issues. Some of the conservation areas are resourced by panels that are better resourced than others in some ways. So we need to look at new and innovative ways of working. And that includes developing more joint working between the council and the panels. So following on from the report last year, we've been doing quite a lot of further consultation, informal consultation, particularly with the conservation area panels. We had a very useful heritage workshop back in September last year, and we had a series of further meetings with all the conservation panels. That resulted in a very valuable exchange of views and information, and that's fed into a couple of key reports that are actually appended to the committee papers tonight. Firstly, the overarching report and recommendations, and that gives some recommendations on boundary changes, the identification of some key unlisted buildings, Article 4 directions and design guidance. And secondly, what I call the generic management plan. Again, that's been updated significantly to provide clearer and more robust guidelines and parameters for dealing with development across the conservation areas. I've actually provided all the conservation area panels with detailed responses on all the points they've raised as well. So I'm not going to obviously go through all the recommendations, but a key one relates to some of the boundary changes that we're recommending. So following on from last year, officers are still recommending that we do look at reducing some of the conservation area content, and these are areas highlighted in red on this map. So that includes, for example, the canals network in Ealing. quite unusually for a London borough, our entire network of canals are included in the conservation area, and it's quite narrowly defined along the towpath. But we found that quite a lot of the area has been degraded in recent years. We're still recommending that the Hanwell Locks, the historic Hanwell Locks area, are retained within that conservation area, but there might be potential to remove some of the other areas. Similarly, with the Cuckoo Estate conservation area in Hanwell, this is a good example of a London County Council estate, but again, there's been quite a lot of degradation in the past through incremental changes. Things like loss of windows, loss of front gardens, a lot of additional porches and that kind of thing. But we're also planning to make a number of additions as well. So, for example, planning to extend the Ealing Cricket Ground conservation area along Madeley Road, quite a number of extensions around the Creffield area. Excuse me. And as part of the most recent consultation, what's come forward is the potential to extend the Haven Green conservation area along Gordon Road and Carlton Road. And we've had a brand new proposal put forward, which includes the along the Northfield Avenue and both sides of the residential areas as well, to include that. So, excuse me, if we were to include those new areas, we would actually see a net increase of conservation area coverage of 8%. So that clearly sort of reverses the previous proposal. All of this, of course, is subject to the public consultation that's coming up. And we're going to be carrying out some further public and stakeholder consultation, probably towards the end of this year and early into next, and also some further statutory consultation with those directly affected by boundary changes and Article 4 directions. And we'll also be continuing to work with the panels in developing specific area guidance. So the next consultation will link with the wider public and residents groups. We'll talk to local amenity and history groups, but also include national and statutory bodies such as Historic England. And of course, we'll be talking to adjoining and local authorities, because quite a few of our conservation areas abut other local authority boundaries. And finally, just to stress that no final decisions have been taken in terms of the review. All of the recommendations made so far are officer recommendations, but the council will take that final decision after the next round of stakeholder and public consultation. So there'll still be scope to consider all views, including those not originally supported by officers, and that's particularly where new information or evidence comes forward about heritage assets. I'd just like to thank all the panels in particular that have fed into the review so far. Their input has been very valuable, so happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Renato. Before I throw it open to questions from councillors, I did have a question, or really more of a statement from a member of the public, that he's not able to be here tonight to ask the question himself. So he's asked if I can read it out. So I will do that. I think Renato has sort of answered some of it already, really, but I'll read out his statement anyway, and just get any response. Here it is. Biodiversity in the UK is lower than many other countries, 53% according to the Natural History Museum. Why are there proposals to reduce conservation areas anywhere at all in the London Borough of Ealing, making it possible for new buildings to be erected in such areas? I strongly oppose this. So, okay, that's it. I don't know, Renato, if you have a quick response to that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we'll provide Mr. Herring with a written response, but just very briefly, I think Mr. Herring's referring to the Natural History Museum recent publication, which talked about the UK being in the bottom 10% in terms of remaining biodiversity in the areas. obviously, as part of the conservation area review, we're much more focused on the architectural and historic value of conservation areas. But clearly, a lot of those areas do contain green and open spaces, and the water environment that actually forms a key part of the conservation areas. So, where we're supporting the protection and enhancement of those areas, this will also have the dual effect of actually, meeting biodiversity objectives as well. The council as well will also be producing a separate biodiversity action plan as well. In terms of the reductions of areas, as I've set out in the presentation, we're looking at a number of reductions and additions to boundaries to reflect the significance of these assets in the present day. So we want to preserve the most significant areas of conservation area value and remove those which are considered to devalue the concept of conservation designation. And finally, removal of conservation area status doesn't necessarily mean that those areas will be developed in future. The development will still need to be tested against other policies in the local plan, and some of those sites may already benefit from other designations such as, green belt or metropolitan open land or community open space, etc. So, each area, each development will be tested on its merits. So, and as I've said in the presentation, if those latest proposals are taken forward, we'll actually see an increase in conservation area coverage, not a reduction. Okay, thanks, Renato. Any councillors? I can't see any councillors' hands up. Is there anyone who wants to, I can now see Simon, Councillor Woodruff. Okay, Councillor Woodruff, go ahead.
It's just, I was just interested in this Northfields proposal because I've only just heard of it. I wasn't aware that there was a Northfields proposal. I appear to live in it, and I haven't, and this is the first time I've sort of heard of it. Okay, and this was a proposal put forward by Kay Garmison, if I can say that, Kay, if you're still on the line. It's an interesting area based along the Northfield Avenue. And it stretches all the way from Dean Park allotments in the north all the way to Little Ealing Lane to the south. And it includes the sort of residential hinterland to both sides of those areas. It's quite a large area, so I think further work needs to be done to sort of finalise the boundaries. But it's an interesting area in terms of some of the heritage, particularly along Northfield Avenue, some remaining heritage, but it is also quite mixed area in terms of that as well. So how far are we going? How far have we got along before we get to consultation?
So we've got some outline proposals, and Kay's done quite a lot of work in terms of research within that area. So we will consult with the public on those proposals and see what sort of feedback we get, also with the public, but also with the other statutory bodies I mentioned.
And you haven't got a timeline?
As I mentioned, we're probably going to do that the next round of consultation towards the end of this year and early into next year.
Okay, thanks, Renato. Okay, well, the idea that we would have time at the end for general discussion seems to not really worked out as well as we'd originally planned, but I hope people have had a chance to raise the points they wanted to raise during the individual presentations. We did have a number of members of the public who indicated they wanted to contribute. Kay, have we covered the sort of points that you wanted to raise?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and there was Libby. I don't know if Libby is still on here. I can't see her name.
She's left, Chair, but she said thank you.
But she said thanks. Okay, and there was also Rena, but I can't see her on the call either. So okay, I guess she's not here. are there any, I think if people will sort of bear with me for just a few minutes, although we are now at 8 o'clock, are there some other points that people want to raise? I think we should have, at least a few more minutes of general discussion if there are points that people want to raise, and hopefully people don't have to rush off immediately. So, are there some contributions? Councillor Woodruff, is that your hand again, or is it just left over from the previous one?
It's legacy.
Okay.
I will change it.
Okay, I can't see any other hands. So is everyone who wanted to contribute, does everyone feel that they've had a chance to have their say, ask their questions and so forth? Okay, I'll take it as a yes. Go on, is that someone wanted to speak?
No, Chair, I just wanted to make sure I'm just thinking about the Cambridge model in Ealing. So it's good to know that I was just, while we are doing this meeting, I was watching news. So they said the best Britain's new building 2021, and 3 buildings in Cambridge, and especially eco-friendly mosques. So I must say, Johanna, thank you, the work they are doing it. And I think we need to get the Cambridge model in Ealing. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, that's congratulations. Was that the Sterling Prize or something? Was that Tariq that you were watching about? I think that's due to
exactly,
be
yeah. That was in the national news as well. That the best 20 or 10 new building in Britain. So the 3 of them were in Cambridge.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, Cambridge is doing well there. Well, next year we'll have some of them in Ealing. Let's hope that if the design review panel and the community review panel do their work, let's aspire to that. Okay, thanks, Councillor Mahmood. Anyone else have any? Is there any other business that anyone wants to raise before we wrap up? Okay, well, if not, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks very much to all of the presenters that you've given us quite a bit to think about, and thanks to the councillors who've contributed. The next meeting is on 23rd of November, and the topic for discussion then will be climate action. So that should be another interesting meeting with an important topic. So I'll hopefully see, most of you at that meeting then. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.